Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Archives of American Art's Unboxed Lunch. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this is being recorded. I also want to gratefully acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the indigenous territory of the Piscataway and Nacotchtank peoples, as well as recognize the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. My name is Nora, and we're thrilled you're joining us for lunch, which I'm enjoying here in Cleveland Park in DC. And our national collector, Josh T Franco, is joining us from the Archives DC office in the Victor Building. Our digital archivist, George Apodaca, is joining us from his home in Silver Spring. Today's event is all about the papers of abstract expressionist painter Frederick Hammersley and the records of the Frederick Hammersley Foundation, which Josh and George will be diving into with all of you all in just a few minutes. At any time during the webinar, you can submit your questions to Josh and George using the Q&A function in Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, the Archives of American Art would also like to gratefully thank the Frederick Hammersley Foundation, whose gifts to the Archives of American Art makes programs like Unboxed Lunch possible. Thank you. Now, I'd like to introduce Josh T Franco, National Collector at the Archives of American Art.
Hi, Nora. Thanks, and hi to all our guests out there.
I think you're muted, Josh.
How's that?
It's better.
Okay, great. Charlotte can hear me too, I see. So thanks, Nora. And hi to all our friends out there. I know we have a special crew in New Mexico at the Hammersley Foundation also joining us, and it's so great to be able to get together this way. So Unboxed is all about featuring new unprocessed collections, and that's what we're going to get to when I introduce my colleague George and the Hammersley Foundation records. But to give us some context, I did want to start with a very processed collection, one that we have put a lot of effort into processing and making available, the Frederick Hammersley papers. So these are the papers of the artist himself, generated by him, organized by him, and donated after his death by the foundation. This collection has been digitized with funding from the Hammersley Foundation. There are around 40,000 images available from the collection online if you go to the Hammersley Finding Aid. And the foundation supported the digitization of other collections as well. So it's a great resource, not only for studying Hammersley, but others. So just to give you, Hammersley had a great sprawling practice, lots of mediums, very interesting life, but just to give you some basics. He was born in 1919, spent most of his adult life split between California and New Mexico. He moved to New Mexico in 1968, and he passed away in 2009, so spent a substantial part of his life there. He's also part of a kind of subgroup within the archives that has been really interesting to discover over my years here, and that is artists who are veterans of World War II. It's interesting not only because of their veteran status and how they carried their role as artists in that role, but also because the GI Bill funded so many of their arts educations after they returned home. And Hammersley used his GI Bill to fund his last year of study at the Schwinn Art Institute in LA. So evidence of that, we have a sketchbook in Hammersley's records from those years, 1942 to 46. And I just want to show you quickly some kind of things in here, very typical. You can imagine him sketching these in downtime as a soldier. I think every artist in the world has sketched hands at some point, and this sketchbook is full of typical early artist sketches that are usually based on the human figure. His work, as you'll see, veered into wildly different territories after that, but it's good evidence of his early skill as a conventional figure drawer. A little more experimental, and leading to the main topic today, things are going to get really meta and overlap, so just get prepared for that. Also included in his papers are sort of more enigmatic, although there is context to explain them, but enigmatic on their own objects like these. These are typical administrative punch cards from a kind of early digital era when analog things like this were still necessary to input computer data and organize it. And George will tell us more about what these were used for, but they are very much sourced from his teaching role at the University of New Mexico. I think you can see the name there, the institution. but became part of his experimental art practice using computer software, which is just one of the mediums he delved into. And then computers made possible the Hammersley Foundation records. And one of the special things about this collection is that it's entirely born digital, which means it was created digitally and has come to us digitally. And we have many dedicated archivists on our staff, but one of them is George Apodaca, my colleague, who's a digital archivist, and other archivists have training in this field as well. But George was especially hired for this. We met at a rare book school course dedicated to born digital materials and special collections, and George came on board a few months after that. So I'll leave it there, and George can start describing what born digital materials are and how we brought in these records and what they are. So George Apodaca, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh, for that helpful introduction. And I'll just follow up by expanding on what that term born digital means. As its name implies, are materials that originate in a digital form. So this includes anything from a word processing document to email, digital images and video, as well as software and computer-based art. I'll also offer a quick disclaimer as to what we really mean when you'll hear me refer to the contents of this Unboxed as a database. The database, which was kept and maintained by the foundation as a sort of, but certainly not a catalog raisonné of Frederick's works, are actually now 14 individual PDFs that contain the exported contents of the database. Back in October 2019, Josh and I traveled to Santa Fe to visit with Kathleen Shields, the executive director of the Hammersley Foundation, in order to interface with the database and chat about potential solutions for archiving it. Our main goal was always to capture as much of the information as possible in as open a format as possible. Shortly thereafter, we all decided that it would be best to export the relevant contents of the database into these 14 individual PDFs in order to provide immediate access to the resource and to also not be hamstrung down the line with proprietary system we'd most likely not have internal support for. Working together with Kathleen to make sure we exported everything meant to be donated to the archives, we combined all of the relevant fields from the different database tables and exported them into these digital objects, which is what I'll now be sharing with you all. Allow me to share my screen really quickly.
George, while you do that, I'll just note your background is an image by Hammersley, and he ultimately would be associated with hard edge abstraction and identified as an abstract classicist, which is a name from a 1959 exhibition he was included in on the West Coast.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. That's, I think, when he came to prominence, but he was always very active before and after that period of time. Before I dive into the actual individual PDFs, I'd like to highlight two very resourceful documents that Kathleen created as part of the donation and that we hope will aid researchers throughout their studies of Hammersley. The first being the key to the spreadsheet of works by Frederick, and the second, another document, guidelines for captions of works by Frederick Hammersley. The key lists the fields that compose the original database, such as image, inventory number, title and date, medium, dimensions, signature and date location, collection to which the artwork may belong to, notes, and if present, sometimes you'll see a bibliography and exhibition field. Of note is a primer on Frederick's unique cataloging system that he used to document his artworks, seen here on the screen, which with a keen eye will help. Yes,
the shared screen isn't showing up. Do you want to try again?
Oh, it's not. Yeah, let's do that. Oops.
There we go.
Okay,
Thanks.
sweet. Sorry about that. So this is the key to spreadsheet. Of note is a primer on Frederick's unique cataloging system that he used to document his artworks, which with a keen eye will help researchers discern exactly what kind of painting, drawing, or sketch they may be looking at. My favorite tidbits from this document are two acknowledgements. The first being that for paintings, the number included with the title and date is not to be considered part of the title, but rather serves to note the work's position in the sequence of paintings he produced that year. The second being that if an artwork contains a frame, it was artist made and should be considered part of the artwork itself. The guidelines for captions document explains the general conventions to take note of when citing Frederick's work for both his paintings and works on paper, as well as his infamous computer drawings. In general, for his paintings and works on paper, only the first word of a title is capitalized unless there is a proper noun in the title. And secondly, all caps are used for the titles of his computer drawings in accordance with how they were printed. Let's take a glimpse at what these individual 14 PDFs look like. And let me just pull up the one I'd like to show you. You'll notice that each entry consists of the database fields I spoke about earlier, alongside a low-res JPEG to serve as a basic visual aid. In total, there are around 3,971 individual database entries, each now taking up a single page in one of these 14 PDFs. As we navigate through these individual PDFs, a researcher would notice that they've been grouped accordingly to their file naming convention. So PDFs 1 through 4 explicitly relate to his computer drawings, and whereas 5 through 12 detail his numerous paintings, drawings, watercolor paintings, color studies, geometric sketches, and paintings, his organics, among other types. And I'll finally briefly mention that PDFs number 13 through 14 include information derived from the Charlotte Jackson Fine Art Gallery in Santa Fe, while the pieces were in their possession and kept in their inventory. And that while some may be duplicates of entries in other PDFs, they contain information not contained in the original database entry. Once again, a well-deserved shout out to Kathleen Shields for working with myself and the database's technical support team to export these into individual PDFs and making them researcher ready for the archives.
Just a quick question, George. And that is about access, online access to born digital materials. Because they are born digital, does that mean that they are automatically easier to access online?
One would think that, once we accession or process the material, we could easily put it online, but unfortunately, they still have to go through a processing phase, which is what our archivists typically do, arranging them and describing them and organizing them into a finding aid, which is essentially the document that helps researchers locate and retrieve content from, sometimes these collections vary in size from 1 box to 100 or more. So the finding aid is really kind of like a location device, and born digital materials kind of have to go through that process before we're able to provide access to it online.
Just to add, when we do provide access to the Hammersley Foundation records, in a reading room, for instance, it will happen at a dedicated station in our currently being renovated reading room. George, do you want to describe the name for the station? I like it.
Yeah, we've affectionately called it the Digital Archives Reading Room Terminal, short for DART. And like Josh mentioned, this will be a terminal computer that will be air gapped, so it won't be connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. And we'll have, you won't be able to connect any removable media to it or download any information from the terminal to, say, your own personal hard drive. And this is just meant to preserve the copies and be responsible stewards of the intellectual content that the archives is responsible for. I'll just actually go here and show you on the screen one entry for which we are custodians of the physical objects. Here you can see the database entry for CS0001, which from the key we come to understand means it was a color study, and which Josh has so kindly taken out of Frederick's personal papers to show you up close and personal. Another database entry. Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I just want, as we go through, we pulled a couple of these examples because it's very nice connections, but can also be confusing. So to explain what's happening here, the database we're looking at is the inventory of Hammersley, full body of work. The Hammersley Foundation, like all foundations, are people who are left in charge of making those decisions about such lists or inventories. Had to do things, people decide to do different things. For some, this inventory would include only finished works. For some, the other limit is every single thing, study, sketch, and scrap of paper that was associated with the artist. Hammersley goes broad. And so it includes artworks for sure, but it also includes things like studies and sketches and proofs, and those are in our collecting scope. So we don't have final artworks here. Those are other places, and we'll talk about that. But we do have some of these other things that are in the inventory because they are sketches, proofs, studies. So that's great. So researchers, when they're looking through the inventory, won't have access to the artworks directly at the archives, but many of the studies and proofs they do. So this color study is a perfect example. Yeah.
The color study here that Josh is holding up is exactly a perfect example of not a finished artwork, but something that falls under the scope that the archives collects. Another entry, a database entry for which we also have a working proof. This one is inventory number PR0064 from the key. It lets us know it's a print titled Seedling. And then finally, ST0001, ST meaning study, to give a glimpse of what potentially a researcher visiting the archives would be able to do with our materials and these PDFs. Looking at other entries for this series,
I just point out the 3D-ness of this one. I think it's kind of between object and draft as well.
Right. We have what Josh is holding in front of you right now is really unique in the sense that it's a wooden board, not necessarily painted on a sketch or painted on a canvas or considered a sketch. But something I want to highlight is also the description field for the piece that Josh is holding. So he's holding number 1, square color trial, but we also have artist note for ST0003, which is number 2 in the square color trial, where he notes it's 1 less red. And then this third piece, number 3, it has less 2 reds plus 1 yellow.
Yeah, and there's about 8 in this box that holds these also. I won't pull them all out, but they follow, you could follow the description here with the objects.
I want to chime in here and just encourage folks who are familiar with Frederick personally or his work who are on the Zoom. Please feel free to chime in the chat with things you know about these works or anything that we're talking about. Those are fun details to share with everyone. And since I'm on camera, I will ask another question that we have, which is about Born Digital Archives being available only at the DC Archives office, or will they also be available in New York, which is our other regional office?
Absolutely. Yes, they should be able to access them both in our DC office and in our New York office. Currently, because we are, shut down because of the pandemic, our reading room is closed, but our reference department is providing access to Born Digital process material using the same, not allowing downloads to occur via Dropbox. So if you find you'll see an electronic reference series in selected finding aids describing the process Born Digital material of that collection. You can send an email to our reference department and they will set up a locked down Dropbox folder that will allow you access to those materials for around 2 weeks. But of course, we can extend it if need be.
Thanks, George.
Yeah. Something that Frederick was known for was his stylistic progression from still life and portrait paintings to what he best became known for, which is, as you all are aware by now, was his style of hard edge abstractionism. He was masterful at being able to systematically reduce traditional imagery into flat, colored, and pattern shapes. And I wanted to show you all an example of how he accomplished this. On the left, you have the painting red, yellow, black, and white, which were the only colors he used on his palette to create this work. And on the right, you have the 13th iteration of him attempting his simplification and abstract flattening of form. As I scroll down a bit, you'll also see earlier attempts of this process documented in the database. Switching gears a bit, let me show you guys. Switching gears a bit, bad pun intended, some would say, a la Frederick, given his notoriety for almost always attaching a very witty verbal title to his works, no matter how nebulous the association. The period of time I found most fascinating from his artistic career was his experimentation with what he dubbed computer drawings. The most famous he is known for referred to as the series of 72. As Josh mentioned, in 1968, having been a longtime resident of Los Angeles and its West Coast abstract classicist movement, he moved to Albuquerque to teach at the University of New Mexico, where he first encountered Art 1 in a computer class. Art 1 was the computer program he used to create these wonderful artworks and was developed by electrical engineer and UNM faculty member Richard Williams. Art 1, coupled with the university's IBM 360 mainframe computer, was one of the first computer programs designed for visual artists and allowed Frederick to create these spectacular arrays of precise geometric arrangements reminiscent of his hard edge drawings, prints, and paintings. These featured a variety of forms, including squares, circles, zigzags, arches, and waves, with dark and light tones created through Frederick's choice of spacing of the characters. Using computer punch cards, such as the one Josh showed you previously, the IBM mainframe and an IBM 1403 line printer as his tools, Frederick used the 26 capital letters of the alphabet, 10 numerals, several punctuation marks, and 11 symbols to render what you're now seeing on the screen. 2 printing arrays were possible. That is, a second series of characters could be printed over the initial layer. And Eric will now share with you in the chat 2 Hammersley quotes, which I found enlightening regarding his creative process. The first from a 2003 interview and another from an essay he published in 1969.
And George, can I just interrupt because I see a very good question from Robert Suter in the chat. For Hammersley's relationship to hard edge peers and a list of names. So I don't know about those names specifically in the archives. I encourage you to visit our website, but just generally about the the debates around abstraction at this time in the US. I do want to point out we're also the home of Jackson Pollock's papers, and a lot of the discourse around Hammersley and on the West Coast was centered on distinguishing themselves as hard edge abstractionists in a particular way, directly against the more gestural, splashy abstraction of Pollock by name often in the discourse. So you have that kind of bi-coastal context of these scenes both at the archives, which is, I think, a great thing.
That is a great point. Yes, the semi-clash of the coasts, if you will. While you read those quotes, oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
There's just another question. This is Born Digital is a very interesting and new topic for everyone. So there's these exciting questions. And one of them is, this is from Suzanne, and it's a technical question. Am I correct that the implication here is that all images, Word files, inventory lists, etc., need to be saved as PDFs in order to be preserved for an artist's legacy?
So can I start answering that, George? But I like my analogy. That's very, it can be uncomplicated. So, here's a box of physical papers. I never have to think twice about the company that made the box, nor I have to talk to them, except for when we order more boxes. With Born Digital material, all of a sudden, the people who make the box, the container, are very involved, and we have to think a lot about their job and ours. So Hammersley used a very reputable third-party platform to organize all of this data. But because that's proprietary software, it's not ideal for preservation. So it was ideal and great for the organization and creation of the record, but not ideal for its preservation. And that's where George comes in. And from what I understand, there are multiple options and theories, PDF versus emulation versus et cetera. And it's a wild kind of field that we talk a lot to our peer institutions about. But I'll let George say more.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times it depends on the file format of the document that we're trying to preserve. Since this was a third-party proprietary database system, it didn't make sense for the archives to take that in and keep it as a preservation object. It was easier to extract or export all of the contents that were in that database into these individual PDFs that you're seeing. Like I mentioned earlier, because of easier researcher access, and PDFs are a more stable, supported format that will hopefully last longer than many of us. So hopefully you had some time to read those quotes. I'll actually pull up some images I took of his works displayed at the New Mexico Museum of Art to highlight those characters and what you wouldn't be able to see, unfortunately, with those low-res JPEGs that are in our database entries. But here is capital 1, and there's 2 layers printed. You may or may not be able to see 2 layers printed here, which is what makes it darker from the lighter tones. And I think these are 8s, and these are 8s plus 0s. I'm taking a guess there. And here he has an array of periods, maybe a semicolon because of the line printer and how new it was. They seem closer together than they would normally appear on a screen. But I wanted to show another example of that, which is this one. It's called Yo-Yo. And I'll just zoom in a little bit closer for y'all to actually appreciate his art. So I'll zoom out so you can see kind of goes up and down, up and down. That's where he gets the name Yo-Yo from. And we'll zoom in, and some are commas or apostrophes. These are commas or periods, dashes, and the like. So today we might be able to generate one of these drawings in about 20 minutes on our computers, but it took Frederick the better part of a week to work out which holes he wanted punched out and actually print the drawing. If there were errors, as they inevitably were, he'd have to go home, figure out which holes had been punched incorrectly, and punch a new set of cards again, hoping to have sorted out the correct answer to his previous problem. As you read from his quotes, this was a period of intense experimentation, fine-tuning, and overall burst of creativity that guided his paintbrush, ultimately refining the visual ideas he had in his head into a finite set of instructions the computer then generated. What I found most fascinating, let me just go back here. What I found most fascinating, as well as undoubtedly any other person who has studied Frederick's computer drawings to some degree, is that the same computer which was used for UNM's payroll was the same computer which calculated scientific and mathematical equations for the Manhattan Project. So, except now, seemingly out of nowhere, this behemoth of a machine had found another new use. With his computer drawings, Frederick had forged this marriage between the scientific and artistic avant-garde communities.
That's so cool. I just want to point out to everyone that what you're seeing George kind of go through in the research he's done is interesting, because George's role is to manage information, but then he becomes a sort of specialist in these artists, and I like watching
by proxy. Yeah. And I've always appreciated art. I'm no art historian by any means. I took an AP art history class in high school, but since then, I've kind of, I think, maybe developed somewhat of an appreciation for this kind of art and others. But I think I love the geometry and the hard edge, even before I knew of Frederick. So this was a beautiful coupling for me to be able to show you guys what we have at the archives today. So just moving on very quick. Oh, yes.
Not yet. Here's a comment from Patrick Frank, who said about a dozen people at the University of New Mexico made works with Art One.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yes. I believe Catherine Nash was also the artist that was working with Richard Williams, but I wasn't able to kind of scope out my research beyond Frederick. I'm sure there are plenty who I would encourage you to look. I think I saw a couple as I was doing some online searching, and some eerily reminiscent, others that kind of, instead of the hard edge, have more of like a wave form, which I found extremely fascinating as well. So he was only at UNM for 3 years before deciding to dedicate himself full-time to creating art, but he remained in Albuquerque for the remainder of his life. During the 1970s, Hammersley focused on a series of mostly black and white compositions, and he produced the largest geometric paintings of his career, typically no larger than 45 by 45 inches. Other examples include Common Courtesy, one of my personal favorites, and the one Josh is now standing in front of you here, that we saw on our trip to visit Kathleen in 2019.
And just to point out, I think that's significant too, that this is all digital information, but it did require a trip for you and I to go and sit with Kathleen at her computer to understand how these records were created. So even though it's digital, it required that travel and direct interaction.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm not as well-versed in database management as I wish I were. So because there are so many different kinds or different companies that provide database softwares, it just made the most sense to go and interface with the database in Santa Fe. Here we have, in Albuquerque, I'm sorry. Here we have You're Just Like Your Mother, which earned him a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1973. The early 1980s was known as his second phase of geometric paintings, the first occurring between 1959 and 1968. This coincided with what are known as his organic paintings and was known as one of his most prolific periods. Perhaps having felt that a sense of rejuvenation after working on the computer drawings, as highlighted by his quote where he mentions he had painted himself out. For his organics, he painted on wood panels, masonite, rag paper, and linen on wood panels. And these are more intimate and complex in form than his earlier geometric paintings, rarely larger than 12 by 14 inches. His paintings from this period were mounted in a unique wooden frame, which Frederick crafted using hand tools and which were specifically tailored, posing a balanced contrast to the painting they hold. Beginning in the mid-1990s, there was a renewed interest in Hammersley's works, which resulted in a number of significant exhibitions and reinvigorated his commercial success, as well as reconnected him to a national audience. Several other exhibitions augmented his reputation, and in 2007, he had his last solo museum exhibition before he passed in 2009. The exhibition featured all 72 of Hammersley's computer drawings. Lastly, to wrap up, I'll share with you a picture I took on that same trip to New Mexico alongside its corresponding database entry of a self-portrait in the mosaic technique Frederick constructed using stained glass on magnesite in the hopes that, you know, it moves you as much as it moved me back then.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Josh. I know there's a ton of questions in the chat and the Q&A, but we've gone over already a bit, and I don't want to take up too much of people's time. However, if you want to continue the conversation, please feel free to email me at danielsn@si.edu. And that's my last name and the initial of my first name. And my colleague, Eric, is putting that into the chat. Excuse me, I believe right now. Yes, it's right there. So please email me and I can pass along the email to Josh or George or bring in whoever who can answer your questions. I want to thank again Josh and George for this wonderful program today, for joining us. I also really want to thank again the Hammersley Foundation and Kathleen. Thank you so much for your support. It's been really great working with you. And I want to say that support from friends like you makes it possible for us to share collections like Frederick Hammersley's with curious people across the world. If you'd like to know more about your gift being recognized in Unboxed Lunch, please email me. Again, my email is in the chat, or use, or my email's in the chat. I don't need to say it again. To support, you can always support the work of our collectors and archivists on our website at aa.si.edu/support. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the spring, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.